Hello again, everyone. I think it was last Tuesday that President Donald Trump came out with his fire and fury threat against North Korea. And, you know, when you hear stuff like this, especially as an American citizen, you just have to shake your head. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. You just, you don't know what's going on. You know, when Trump says stuff like this, it reminds me of some fool going duck hunting with an AK-47. I mean, you spray, magazines of bullets into the sky, but you probably won't hit anything. You know, it's just silly. You just spraying bullets for the hell of it. So he's been mouthing off to North Korea about stuff, these threats. And, and it wasn't that long ago that Rex Tillerson was, trying to be nice, because he's a Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. And, he was trying to calm the waters, pour oil on the waters, calm things down. And here's his quote. I had it in one of my earlier videos, but I'm going to put it up again. Here's Rex Tillerson's quote. We do not seek a regime change. We do not seek a collapse of the regime. We do not seek an accelerated unification of the peninsula. We do not seek an excuse to send our military north of the 38th parallel. We are trying to convey to the North Koreans, we are not your enemy. We are not your threat. Rex Tillerson. So then Trump comes out with this business just, last Tuesday. And here we go. And it's, apparently it was just improvisational. He spouted off the top of his head, extemporaneous thoughts. Opens his mouth without engaging his brain. So here's a statement. North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. Kim Jong Un has been very threatening beyond a normal state. They will be met with fire and fury and, frankly, power the likes of which this world has never seen before. Yeah, okay. I'm beginning to get the idea that that Trump thinks that the history of the world began on January 20th of this year, when he was inaugurated. Before that, whatever happened before that it doesn't really matter. It's only what's happening now in Trump time. It's before Trump, after Trump, or now, doesn't Trump know what went on during the Korean War? You talk about fire and fury. That was really a very nasty war. And it was a total war against the population, the civilian population of the country. Here's a famous quote by the Air Force General Curtis LeMay, and I've showed you this before, but here it is again. And let me read it to you here. So we went over there and fought the war and eventually burned down every town in North Korea. Over a period of 3 years or so, we killed upwards of 20% of the population of Korea as direct casualties of war or from starvation and exposure. So isn't Trump aware that that's what happened? You talk about fire and fury. After the war, there was only one small building standing in Pyongyang. I mean, everything you see built in Pyongyang now has been built since the end of the war, and this has all been in my lifetime. So doesn't Trump understand that? I mean, doesn't he understand when he says it's fire and fury nonsense? And doesn't he understand that this is what motivates the North Koreans to frantically screw together their rockets and nukes? Because they'd rather not lose 20% of their population again? Doesn't he think about these things? I don't know. I don't think he gets that part. You know, when you have a problem and you're confronted with a problem, what's the first things you do? You say, well, you know, how did I get into this problem? How did I get myself into this mess? So maybe you can walk back the cat and figure out probably the same way that he got into the mess, you can back out of it. You can reverse your steps, and very often you can. You know, you drive into a dead-end street, well, you turn around and go back. You know, you jump out of an airplane without a parachute, well, you're probably screwed. Unless you can learn how to fly on the way down, you know, or land in a huge snowbank or something. That's been done. Anyway, but as I said before, you know, Trump is one of these mega wealthy types that's created his own world, his own little universe, and populates it with people inside his, you know, and you know, he's surrounded by nothing but ass kissers. And for all intents and purposes, you know, Trump lives on a separate planet. Now, when he was campaigning, I didn't think this. I thought, you know, I kind of liked his style and his approach because I thought of him as a blue-collar billionaire. It was my name for it, you know, blue-collar billionaire. Because he seemed to me the kind of guy that would, you know, on the construction sites, he'd go out and talk to the people, and he did. And he'd talk to the guys and whatever, and he, you know, he had the common touch. You know, like Henry Ford or John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, people like that became very, very wealthy, but still never forgot the common man. I mean, Henry Ford was famous for that. You know, he never forgot the guy on the production line. And so the Trump, it seems like Trump, that's kind of been a veneer or something where he kind of gave you that impression, but not really, you know. You can see Trump getting rid of all the little people that helped him get elected, you know, that worked in his campaign, that the loyalists, the people that got on board and helped him. Well, now he's gradually shifting all them out. There's only a couple, three left. Now, he brought in people like this fellow here, HR McMaster. And McMaster is Trump's national security advisor. And this guy is a real piece of work. And very often you can judge a leader, you know, a CEO of a corporation or a leader, something like that, by the people that he or she chooses to surround themselves with. So you always look at somebody's subordinates, and that gives you a real good indication of who they are, what type of people they are. So here we got McMaster. And this guy, I mean, you know, he kind of reminds me of another anti-Semite with a shaved head and a sinister look about him, Julius Streicher, a big Nazi big shot. I mean, he had that intimidating look, you know, and McMaster, you know, here he is again, he stares into that camera, and it's just a look of hatred. I mean, there's no other way to interpret McMaster's look as a look of sheer hatred. Like, you know, in fact, you know, we can probably rename him, easily rename him, or refer to him as HR Fuck You McMaster. And I put it here just for the hell of it. But HR McMaster reminds me of another HR that served for another president. And that was H.R. Haldeman. Here he is here. And H.R. Haldeman on the cover of Newsweek, and he had that same look. H.R. Haldeman had that famous statement, "Every president needs a son of a bitch. I'm Nixon's son of a bitch." And you know what happened to Nixon? Nixon got himself in trouble by surrounding himself with these anti-Semite tough guys. You know, that's really what they were. And I mean, Nixon had no great love for Jews. And now you're starting to see that, I think, in the Trump administration. You're really starting to have problems there. And that's always a bad sign. When you see that, you know, rockets go off. flares, you know. But you know, both HR McMaster and HR Haldeman, you know, with that look, you know, I don't know what that's all about. You know, I mean, they're trying to, I guess, trying to convince people that, you know, they bite the heads off puppies and drink their blood. I don't know. But it's not good to have this. But there's Trump surrounding himself with these kind of people. You know, I'm not sure about Kelly, the chief of staff, but he seems like he's a jock sniffer for generals. Nixon was a jock sniffer as well. You know, he always admired these strong, masculine, manly types. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. You have take charge guys, but come on, you know, you have to show some consideration for other people's feelings, other people's thoughts and ideas and contributions. McMaster's not that kind of person. He's not well liked at all in the West Wing. McMaster is loathed by most people. He loses his temper, he blows up, he gets mad at people. It's no surprise. I mean, you just look at his picture. And I'll probably do a separate video on this guy. You know, if he's not out of there in a couple of 3 weeks, I'm going to do a separate video on him and really take it to him, really hold his feet to the fire, because he deserves it. You know, our country deserves better than this clown, than this idiot, you know, Julius Streicher too. We don't need this, you know. But anyway, McMaster seems like he really, really wants to go to war with North Korea. I mean, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about a preventative war. And, you know, hit them before they hit us is his idea. And, you know, China, needless to say, China is fairly cool to the idea of the U.S. launching a first strike against North Korea. And in fact, for anybody that's been paying attention to what China's been saying, they've always had the policy, no war on the Korean Peninsula. That's hard and fast Chinese policy. It's been that way for a long time, probably ever since the Korean War. They don't want it to happen again. And it should be the same thing, almost analogous to the United States saying no war in Mexico. And the United States wouldn't want some other country coming into Mexico and, you know, going to war with the Mexican government. That's not going to happen. So in the Global Times, just, what was it, I think yesterday, in the Global Times is like China's Washington Post. They're kind of an organ of the government, a mouthpiece of the government. They don't always, but almost always, they speak for the government. So when you see an editorial in the Global Times, that's generally the thinking of at the highest levels of the Chinese government. So here's a quote, and I just put it up for you here. If North Korea launches missiles that threaten U.S. soil first, and the U.S. retaliates, China will stay neutral. If the U.S. and South Korea carry out strikes and try to overthrow the North Korean regime and change the political pattern of the Korean Peninsula, China will prevent them from doing so. Now that's in plain English. I mean, that's as plain as you can get. China will not permit the U.S. to attack North Korea, the U.S. and South Korea and its allies. It's not going to happen. North Korea has to instigate an issue, instigate a problem. They have to, you know, hit U.S. soil, is what it says here. You know, it launches missiles that threaten U.S. soil, not hit. They say threaten U.S. soil first. So anywhere where there's U.S. territory, Guam, Hawaii, Alaska, you know, anything like that, that threaten. So even if it lands in waters close to America, that would probably be an issue for China, according to what they're saying here, if you want to interpret it this way. But North Korea has, so far, they've kept everything inside their borders. There hasn't even been any dust-ups between North and South Korea along the DMZ. There used to be something every few months, and now that's been very quiet. Nobody's doing anything. China is probably pretty fairly confident in this statement that North Korea is going to contain itself, restrain itself within its borders. They're not going to do anything crazy. So what China's done is they've kicked the ball in America's court. They said, no, if you do this, you can't, But what does McMaster do now because of this plain China statement? Does he still take a shot? Will he risk going to war with China? Douglas MacArthur wanted to widen the Korean War. He wanted to actually drop nuclear bombs on China. And he was prepared to do that. And President Truman stepped in and fired his ass. Just like fired him. This is a huge stink back then. The Republicans were all mad that Truman fired MacArthur. This caused a huge, huge stink. Because he was going to nuke China. I mean, why is this a Republican or a Democrat issue? Why is it a liberal or conservative thing? The war was stupid to begin with. They should have just, once they pushed North Korea on the other side of the DMZ, that should have been it. That should have been the end. That's what they push them back and leave them there. They called the war a police action. I remember my father talking about that. Well, it's a police action. And he used to mock that. And he said, wow, they call it a police action. Look at how many soldiers are dying over there at a police action. This is a war. But they should have just stopped the war. And then that would have been it. And a lot of lives would have been saved. But, and back then, in October of 1950, still in 1950, October 1950, the White House and the Pentagon were saying, well, don't worry that American soldiers will be home by Christmas. And no, about 20 or 25,000 more American soldiers died and didn't come home for Christmas. And I mean, that's just, so here we go again. So anyway, will we have another Korean War? Will McMaster, he seems to be controlling things now. I don't know, but you really have to think about something. And I doubt if McMaster is going to think this thing through. I mean, you take that look on his face. This man doesn't think anything. He's not a reflective person. He doesn't sit down and light a cigar and pour brandy and say, well, give me a couple hours to think this over. No, he acts impulsively. He does things on a whim, and when he does it, he knows he's 100% right. There you go. But if McMaster would launch something against North Korea, keep in mind that North Korea and Iran have been all chummy for the last few years. They've been buddies. I mean, I'm not best buddies, but they've been simpatico, and to use a Spanish word, they're on the same wavelength. And Iran wants to drop nukes on Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's difficult to determine which country they hate more, Saudi Arabia or Iran, or Israel. And so there you got a conflict. As soon as something starts in North Korea, I mean, Iran's going to take a shot and jump in with both feet, because now America is distracted. And then, of course, you have to consider Russia. I mean, Vladimir Putin feels just as strong, or even stronger than China, that the U.S. shouldn't interfere in North Korea. I mean, Russia and North Korea have had warm relations way back, ever since its conception, 1945. And notice, if you will, that even though Russian troops came in to Korea, to North Korea in 1945, they waited at the DMZ because the U.S. had not yet moved into South Korea. So Stalin kept his part of the deal that was made at Potsdam, that Russia gets everything north of the 38th parallel and the U.S. south. So the Russian troops came to the 38th parallel and stopped, and they waited patiently for 2 or 3 weeks until finally the Americans showed up. But then, 2 or 3 years later, Kim Il-sung got everything under control and invited the Russians and the Chinese to leave. You know, thank you very much. You've been very helpful. We'll always be friends, but goodbye. And they both left. Whereas the Americans stayed in North Korea. And for, you know, I mean, you know, in many ways, South Korea has become territory of the U.S. I mean, the U.S. controls South Korea's military. It's under the command and control structure of the Pentagon. Been that way since forever. But Russia left North Korea. But Vladimir Putin has moved a lot of military hardware very close to the border, his side of the border with North Korea, and it's just sitting there. You know, has McMaster thought about this? You know, there's the Russians right there. And, you know, I always thought that China, you know, they issued this statement, but really an effective checkmate that would really get McMaster to stand up and really think, that would really stop him, I think, in his tracks, is if either China or Russia or both simply landed a squadron of fighter planes somewhere in North Korea, and parked them on the apron of a runway and, you know, put tarps over them, you know. And then give Americans something to think about, because now you've got Chinese or Russian hardware on North Korean soil, plus military personnel. And that would, I mean, that seems to me that would put the end to that. But, you know, who knows? I mean, you know, for a lot of years, the lunatics in Washington, D.C. have been running that asylum. I mean, they do some crazy shit in that town. So McMaster is just the latest lunatic to arrive on the scene. And, you know, so I don't know. You know, I mean, take another last look at those eyes and tell me if we might have another war. We might.